And this week on the Communicators, we want to introduce you to Andy Purdy. He is a Chief Security Officer at Huawei Technologies USA. Mr. Purdy, what does that role entail?
Well, primarily it's an internal role. I chair a U.S.-wide committee for cybersecurity and privacy that is similar to the one that we have globally, where you have representatives of each business group, IT, human relations, services, etc., that meets quarterly to manage the requirements for cybersecurity and privacy, to make sure that we are meeting statutory, regulatory, customer requirements and our own internal policies so that we can manage risk from a cybersecurity and privacy perspective. I also work with my government relations and public relations people to talk with customers, talk with stakeholders about issues and try to drive the conversation forward.
Give us a snapshot, if you would, of Huawei.
Well, Huawei is a company with over 180,000 people around the world. About 30% of our products come from Huawei. About 32% of the components of our products come from the United States, about $11 billion a year. We are an employee-owned company. We have, I think, about 80,000 people involved in R&D. We spent $15 billion in R&D last year, which is one of the most important factors and one of the advantages of being private. We don't have to worry about the quarterly numbers. We can invest in the long term, and that's what we're doing. Our people are motivated essentially by two things. We want to be involved in something that is very interesting and very important, and we want to provide well for our families, and I think we're doing both of those.
Who's the founder?
Mr. Wren.
And what's his background?
Well, he was an engineer, and I'm not an expert in it. He was a civil engineer with the People's Liberation Army many, many years ago. And he moved to form his own company with 4 or 5 others with a few $1,000s. And he's had a spectacular growth, not unprecedented in terms of other companies from the late 80s, such as Cisco, that have had dramatic growth also. But he has always incentivized people to produce, to innovate, and to be customer-centric. That's the primary focus of Huawei, is to be customer-centric, to understand their needs and their potentials, and to help meet those. And it's not to get every dollar of profit out of every particular contract. It's to take a long view, that if our customers make money and their customers make money, we're all working well together for a common advantage.
Do any of us in this room right now have a Huawei product in our hand or in our phones or anything?
Well, I have a Huawei phone. I left it in the other room, but no, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Why is Huawei considered a threat to national security here in the U.S.?
Well, it's a complicated issue. There's not a simple answer to it. There is a geopolitical overlay of the issues related to Huawei. They're steeped in, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of China economically and militarily in the world. The reach of China through the Belt and Road Initiative to Africa and around the world, the advances in technology by Africa, the advances in technology by China, excuse me. Some of the issues that the U.S. government has with China have been a major concern, that some of which are the subject of the trade talks. Some may have been deferred to future conversations. So the U.S. is not safe in cyberspace. And so the U.S. looks at things from a risk perspective, whether it's national security or other risks. And from a national security perspective, they don't just look at companies or countries who are hostile to us from a national security perspective. They look at potential. Does a country have the opportunity and capabilities, if they turn against the United States, to cause us great harm? And so it's that kind of a risk-based perspective that is affecting the perspective of the U.S. Toward Huawei. It's really much a country focus, much more than a company focus.
Well, let's bring Drew Fitzgerald of the Wall Street Journal into this conversation. He covers telecom and technology.
Thanks for having me. Andy, I'm curious, there have been rules proposed and rules enacted in the U.S. that have essentially all but banned Huawei equipment from being involved in most telecom networks, wireless and wireline networks in the U.S. So what's the status of Huawei's business operations in America now?
Well, we have about 1,500 employees in the United States. We have a very strong R&D presence. And as I mentioned, we purchased about $11 billion in U.S. components last year. Our business groups, our carrier business, our enterprise, and our consumer business, we are maintaining our revenues at present. The prohibitions in the National Defense Authorization Act, I think, kick in August of 2019, and those are focused on government contracts, which we do not and are not pursuing, and government contractors. And so there may be a greater potential impact going forward. We believe that in the end, the United States is going to have the kinds of measures in cyberspace that are going to make us a whole lot more secure. When we get to that point, we think we're going to be allowed to compete on a level playing field. But in the meantime, our biggest concern is probably our Tier 3 wireless customers that serve rural America. We believe that our technologies and the services we provide them are essential to farmers and schools and citizens and companies in the rural parts of the United States. So we hope we can maintain that service to serve those people.
And you continue doing business with those smaller rural providers in the United States?
Yes, we have about 40 of those customers, yes.
Around the world, there's been a lot of focus on flaws that have been found in code or vulnerabilities in certain Huawei equipment in places like Italy and places like the UK. Is it possible to secure Huawei devices and networks that run off of them, or is that a pipe dream?
Well, it's impossible to eliminate all risk, whether it's 5G or enterprises or whatever. It's impossible to eliminate all vulnerabilities in products. One of the advantages we have, and I do see it as an advantage, is that we are probably one of the most examined and evaluated companies in the world. So the flaws that we have, such as the UK Oversight Board revealed in terms of our software engineering processes, those are the kinds of things that we can improve as part of a continuous improvement process. And that's the kind of thing that we think to make America safer, to make cyberspace safer. Those kinds of risk mitigation measures, looking for those kinds of vulnerabilities, protecting the threats that exist out there. We need to protect against those risks from all vendors. All the major vendors have major operations in China, so if there's concern about the China government, we've got to make sure that we protect against all those threats.
And how does that work? How do these boards examine millions of lines of code, very complex equipment, some of which involves intellectual property that belongs to Huawei?
Well, there are different kinds of programs in different parts of the world. So we have the UK program where we make our source code available for review under oversight by the government and in close collaboration with the carriers, including evaluating the updates. We have programs in Canada that the Canadian government doesn't really want to emphasize very much. You see a situation where a private company is addressing risk in Mexico, where we supply major equipment to AT&T down there, and they're not being pressured to remove our equipment because AT&T is one of the best companies in the world about risk mitigation. We're setting up a program in Bonn, Germany, working closely with the country of Germany and with our security service, BSI, to come up with measures and mechanisms that make sense for understanding risk, addressing risk, testing the products against international standards, but they want to put in a program that's going to address the risk from all vendors. We have another model in Brussels. I recently was part of an opening of a transparency center in Brussels in early March. We let companies, customers, and governments come in, or bring their third-party experts. They can come in and evaluate our code. And we think that kind of external evaluation is a real plus, and we'd like to see other of our competitors get the benefits of that as well.
Andy Purdy, what's your take on the UK Defense Minister being fired related to a Huawei issue?
I don't know about the details of that. My understanding is that there was an allegation that he had leaked information about preliminary discussions within the UK government, which apparently he describes. What I see that as part of a larger picture. I was over in Warsaw a couple months ago when Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, two great Americans, were about to come over, and I was there when they were there. It's amazing the pushback by our closest allies, probably the UK, but Germany, other countries in Europe and other countries around the world that are basically saying, you have not given us, US, you have not given us evidence of cybersecurity wrongdoing by Huawei. And we believe that there are effective risk mitigation measures that can be used. And if we can use those, then we can get the benefits of the technology and perhaps more importantly, the benefits of having competition in this space. We believe competition is essential for the technology, for price, et cetera. And when you look at, we mentioned before that the U.S. is not safe from a cybersecurity perspective. So what does the U.S. do? There are special risk mitigation programs in effect for our competitors, Nokia and Ericsson, to allow them to do business in the United States. They have tremendous presence in China, including Nokia has a joint venture with Shanghai Bell owned by the China government. Somehow there are risk mitigation measures in place that satisfy the U.S. government that Nokia does not present a risk to the United States. We just want to talk with the U.S. government. Let's talk about risk mitigation measures that might work in the U.S. so that we can provide assurance and transparency.
Now, your background, you come from a federal government cyber background, don't you?
Yes, and I was a lawyer for a long time. I was a federal prosecutor. I joined the President Bush team under Richard Clark that drafted the National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace, and then moved on to the Department of Homeland Security back in 2003 when we were setting up the cybersecurity effort. And I later led the U.S. cybersecurity effort for a time from DHS.
So did it take a bit of research on your part to say, yes, I trust Huawei before you joined them?
Well, I don't trust anybody. And frankly, the two-part role that when I was recruited by my global boss, John Suffolk, who'd been the CIO of the UK government, that on the part about reaching out, that we were going to be advocates for a safer cyberspace. I was going to be able to be, and have been able to be, an advocate for a safer American cyberspace. I'm not a defender of Huawei. I'm basically saying, look, we need the best technology. We need to be able to compete. And it's critically important that we address the risk. We believe there are risk mitigation measures. I've never been told what to say or what I can't say. And frankly, when you look at the bigger picture, Huawei, we don't speak through the China government and they don't speak for us. We want to talk with the U.S. government. We believe that ways can be found to mitigate risk.
Now, I'm sure you're familiar with this gentleman, Jim Lewis of CSIS, was
Yes.
recently on this program in this seat, and just want to play a little bit of video of what he had to say about Huawei.
Huawei wants to get into your core network, and the Chinese government subsidizes them to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And what I usually ask people is, do you think it's because the Chinese like your cuisine? I mean, why do you think they're paying hundreds of millions of dollars to get into your phone network? Duh.
Any response to what he had to say?
I missed the first part of what he said. He's spending hundreds of millions of dollars to get into our phone. He's talking about the hardware or the mobile phones?
And that the fact that Huawei is subsidized by the Chinese government.
Yeah, there's no evidence that Huawei is subsidized by the Chinese government. That's typical of the kind of allegation with no basis in fact. Assumptions, yes, but no basis in fact. Our annual report reports each year less than 2% of revenue comes from various kinds of China government funding, and other competitive companies from around the world get to participate in many of those kinds of grants. So it's really not true that we are getting substantial funds from the China government.
Let's bring Drew Fitzgerald back into this conversation.
I want to go back to the risk mitigation issue that you mentioned earlier, because a complaint or an assertion that some in U.S. government have made, whether it's right or wrong, has been that even if you were to review all the code and all the practices of some of your competitors like Nokia and Ericsson, at the end of the day, those are countries that don't always answer to their home governments, but they're domiciled in governments that are friendlier to the U.S. government than China often is as an adversary. What's the company's response to that? There's not much you can do about that, but
well, no, actually, there are several things you can do about it. But first of all, let me mention the scale of operations that take place in China by Nokia, Ericsson, and even Cisco. And in the case of Nokia, the active involvement of the China government in the joint venture with Nokia, to the extent that geographic access presents some risk, clearly the U.S. government has found some ways to address that risk. The other thing is, and I saw a comment by the principal deputy of the Director of National Intelligence recently about two issues. One has to do with backdoors, which she said they could test for, and the other has to do with customer data. There are mechanisms to address the risks. The assumption is that because our equipment's in the network, that we have access to all the information. We're not trying to sell into the core for 5G. We just want to sell into the radio access. And the fact is there are strict requirements when we go to service the customer. There's an assumption that the Huawei network is attached to the customer network, and it's not. So for example, we have mechanisms, and it's all subject to explicit permission by the customer every time, specially configured laptops with virtual private network cloud to access the customer network, and the ability for them to record every keystroke that is logged by that laptop that touches the customer network. We're open to what are some additional measures that could be done to make sure that that data is protected. But the assumptions are wrong. And the fact is, the other part is, people talk like it's the equipment providers have the risk. Well, we have our part of the risk. But the carriers, and you saw Chairman Pai of the FCC just recently reference the fact that our network operators, they own the risk. They control the network. They monitor the inbound, outbound, and internal traffic for anomalous activity.
These are your customers, the network operators.
Yes, they have their responsibilities. The ISO international standards cover it. The ITU standards out of the UN cover their conduct. Very strict, plus they can segment the network so that if there is harm, and we have to assume the bad guys will get in because you can't eliminate all risk, you segment the network so that when something bad happens, you limit the cascading offense. You can control the impacts. So the fact is that where something comes from is a whole lot less important than you take the attitude than we take when a foreign company buys an American company. The U.S. government requires risk mitigation plan overseen by a committee of government agencies to guarantee that there isn't improper undue influence. We believe that's the way to go.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which is the core of the 5G networks. That's the part of the network where whoever, whether it's a cable company or a cell phone company, they can see almost all the traffic that runs across that network. One thing that's interesting about Huawei is you make pretty much every product that's out there. Is the core of 5G networks not a market that Huawei wants to play in?
Well, we'd like to play in all markets. But from a risk mitigation standpoint, from limiting the risk, we've made the choice. And so, for example, the UK government, there was recently an announcement that was made to look like something really bad, that we were not going to be in the core of, for example, the British telecom network. But that was agreed to, that was planned, that was the way it is. But frankly, the distinction between core and non-core, as the standards develop and as we move toward the full rollout of 5G, with the full rollout of 5G, there will be these viral slices in cyberspace that have particularly strong authentication requirements. So it's much less important, the issue of core versus non-core, than it is effective and transparent risk mitigation measures. And we'd love to discuss those.
Let me ask you about in the last quarterly report from Huawei. The company said it's shipped a great deal of base stations, 5G base stations, using this new technology. And is doing business with a number of different providers. What's the status of that? Where are these base stations being shipped? Who are the first companies to use this 5G equipment?
Well, I'm not sure that I can reconstruct the business elements of the 30 or 40,000 base stations that we've sold. I'm not really on the business side. It's some of the most widely publicized early adopters for 5G, and I think there's been tremendous amount. All the contracts are public, but I don't off the tip of my tongue have the specifics of that. But it is interesting that the first quarter this year, our revenues were up 39%. And you look at last year, 2018, you look at the cycle for carrier networks. And we were in a trough last year as we start to move up toward the deployment of 5G. So we're expecting good things in the future.
Are we in danger of having two separate 5G networks, one sponsored by China, one based in the U.S.?
No, I don't think so. And it's interesting that I expect that the U.S. will do what the UK is doing, which hasn't gotten as much publicity. I expect that to help manage risk and to promote resiliency, which is fundamental. We've got to make sure our networks are up and running. They're going to be much more important when we fully deploy 5G. The last 15 years, cybersecurity, people have talked about it, but they haven't really cared about it that much because most people don't really care that much about data breaches. But we're going to be dependent in a serious way on the digitized vertical industries sectors, the government services. And what the U.S. will undoubtedly do, what the private companies will do, is they'll have diversity of suppliers. So hopefully we'll get to be one of multiple suppliers for key nodes, such as radio access. That helps promote resiliency and helps reduce risk.
One of the fears, I think, and this is not a new fear because Huawei's been talked about in this country for years as a potential threat. We saw in Sri Lanka, the internet was essentially shut down on that island. We saw it in Egypt years ago during the spring. Is there a potential that Huawei could shut down people who have Huawei products?
Take a look at the news stories in the last 6 months, last 12 months, of major outages that have occurred around the world with our competitors' providers. The issue of availability of these services, trying to promote greater resiliency, trying to promote clearer standards and accountability for the major carriers to make sure they can meet the needs of our governments, of our companies, of our people, that's critically important. The fact is, we don't have access like the carriers do to the ability to shut down. It's a theoretical issue. We don't continue to control the products after they're in the networks. But from a national security perspective, from the perspective of the well-being of the United States, we have to make sure that the carriers are on board. We have to make sure there are protections relative to risks from the vendors, from the equipment vendors. That's what's going to help us make sure that we can maintain the services that we're going to depend on even more than we do today.
I want to ask more about interoperability because ultimately in many countries most companies are not going to rely on one single supplier for all their equipment. Huawei's involved in a lot of the development of the technical specifications for 5G that everybody's going to use. And there have been some complaints among carriers that those technical standards could be favorable to Huawei, could make it actually harder for a company that wants to use a European or other East Asian provider to switch from Huawei. Is there going to be the ability of a company that wants to switch providers away from Huawei? Are they going to have the ability to do that?
One of the most important operating premises of the development of the really impressive 5G standards that have been coming up with is that interoperability is, I was going to say at the core, but interoperability is critical across the board. So no, the operators have to hold the vendors accountable to meet the standards that are going to require interoperability as well as requiring quality and security requirements. So that's not going to be an issue. Frankly, I'd like to see the United States put a little more money into getting participation in more of the international activities. The government funds have been cut down, so they're not involved in activities as much. Some private companies are involved in the standards efforts. I'd love to see the U.S. have greater visibility into, what are the standards, what's going to be developed, what are the most important threats that are going to be addressed by the standards. Because when you look at 5G, there are significant security enhancements that are being added to make us all safer. And the U.S. weighing in, our allies weighing in to the standards process, I think would be a great thing.
Let me ask you about the ongoing civil and criminal cases that are happening against Huawei in the U.S. Your CFO, Meng Wanzhou, was arrested in Canada earlier this year. Is she going to appear before a U.S. judge? And if so, what do you expect out of that?
Well, I think there's an appearance tomorrow.
In the U.S.?
No,
or
in Canada.
In Canada, in Vancouver?
As a former federal prosecutor, I have an inkling of how much federal judges dislike people involved in cases, talking about those cases. So I'll respectfully defer to others talking about the situations with those two cases.
Do you think then, on a hypothetical level, that this was a political move or a trade positioning move?
There is a context for everything. I am a believer in the criminal justice system of the United States and Canada. I have confidence that the proceedings will be based on facts and based on the law, and that whatever the correct determination is based on the facts of law is what will take place. I do know the process in Canada can be fairly time-consuming, so it may take longer than everyone would like.
Mr. Purdy, you're here while trade talks are going on between the U.S. and China. What role do you see Huawei having in those trade talks, if any?
I don't see any role, frankly. As I mentioned before, although there's been some speculation about Huawei being the subject of talks or parallel talks, we want to talk with the U.S. government. China does not speak for us. We don't speak through China. We have found, just as in the talks in Prague last week, where 30 countries, the U.S., all got together talking about standards. When the operators, the governments, and the vendors come together to talk about what's necessary to understand risk and manage it, we're all going to be a lot better off in the end.
Was Huawei invited to that event in Prague? Did you have any representatives there?
Well, I know my boss was there, John Suffolk, was in Prague for the conference. There was part of the conference that was open, and then I believe there were breakout sessions one afternoon and one morning that have generated the remarks from the chairman of the proceedings about the requirements that many, including the U.S. government, are encouraging the various countries involved in the EU in general to try to incorporate those into their requirements for who to purchase and how to monitor the kind of work that they do.
Let me ask you, especially in Europe, U.S. officials, both at this event in Prague and earlier in the year, have gone to many countries, visited their counterparts, and essentially told them not to buy equipment from Huawei. Has that had any effect on the company's business around the world?
I don't think so. And in fact, I've heard some comments by some of the officials of my company saying that the publicity has been a good thing. I'm not going to go there. And frankly, as an American, I feel a little bad by the harsh response that our allies have generally given to the United States. I mean, I think the United States is the last great bulwark of freedom, of protecting human rights, and so we have a special role in the world. So it saddens me that we can't discuss these issues about how to address risk. Clearly, our allies, for most of them, want to talk about true risk mitigation measures that provide assurance and transparency, and that's what we'd like to do.
Andy Purdy, given your cybersecurity background, your DHS background, what do you think, on a general level, are some of the cybersecurity threats here in the U.S.?
Well, I think they're pretty much everywhere. I think one of the biggest problems is a lack of commitment and leadership around cybersecurity. I think in the last year, 18 months, we've seen some great efforts by Department of Homeland Security, by NIST, but the leadership to make sure that we provide the funding that's necessary to fund the efforts against the election tampering, to help come up with requirements for 5G, to help create greater visibility as to what the leaders of American companies, particularly publicly traded companies, what their due diligence and fiduciary care responsibilities are. There are fundamental things that can be done. We've got to get more action. We need goals, objectives, goals, and milestones to track progress and know when there's success. We need strict oversight by Congress. And we've got a long way to go to improve in those areas.
I think one thing we have not said is that Huawei is now the second largest manufacturer of smartphones in the world, behind Samsung. So.
And I would say that the U.S. government in early 2018 apparently put pressure on AT&T and Verizon not to carry our phones because of security concerns. All I would ask is, if there are security concerns about our phones that operate on the Android platform, it's time to raise the security requirements for all Android phones to make us safer. Let's focus on the issues and let's make us all safer.
Andy Purdy is the Chief Security Officer for Huawei Technologies USA, and Drew Fitzgerald covers telecom and technology for the Wall Street Journal. Gentlemen, thank you. Also want to note that this program and all Communicators programs are available as podcasts.